China has emerged as one of the 21st century's most consequential nations, making it more important than ever to understand how the country is governed. Welcome to Pekingology, the podcast that unpacks China's evolving political system. I'm Jude, Blanchette, the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS, and this week I'm joined by Rory Truex, Associate Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. Today we'll be discussing Timur Kuran's 1991 paper, Now Out of Never, The Element of Surprise in the East European Revolution of 1989. Rory, thanks for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me again.
So we've had you on before. We've already asked the biographical question. So maybe I'll just ask, since we've talked, I don't know, that was maybe 3 or so years ago, maybe just give us a sense of what you're working on now. What sort of puzzles are you unpacking, and any sort of recent research that excites you?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think. The last time we spoke, I think it was mid-pandemic, if I'm remembering correctly. So obviously a lot's happened since then. So I've taken a little bit of a turn in my research. I traditionally have focused on domestic politics in China, but because of the pandemic and other personal reasons, I haven't been able to go to China for a little while now. And so I think, like many in the field, I'm pivoting a little bit to try to focus on something that I can wrap my hands around. I'm currently working on a project with Michael Cerny, who's a young up-and-comer, currently a program associate at the Carter Center. He's going to be starting his PhD at Harvard next year. Michael and I are working on a project about the nature of US-China discourse in DC, and the project centers around interviews with folks like yourself, people in the think tank community who are working on China. So we're trying to get a sense of the nature of the policy discourse and some of the relationships there. So that's one project. Then another one I'm working on, which I'm excited about, is I'm studying Chinese Students and Scholars Associations, so CSSAs, which are often maligned organizations that operate on campuses throughout the world. And they're nominally meant to be sort of social organizations for Chinese students, but we know that they have some ties, some relationship to the Chinese government. So trying to understand what those organizations are like, what they're doing, and how they affect campus life. So those are my two primary projects right now.
That's great. We're asking people starting at the beginning of the year for recommendations of mental tools or heuristics that are useful to them to make sense of China. These could be, I think we've heard China's not a monolith. I think of something Stephen Kotkin once said, the biographer of Stalin, that if you think it's challenging to make sense of what's going on in dictatorship outside of dictatorship, it's just as hard, if not harder, for an actor inside the system. Is there a heuristic that you'd recommend to the audience that you think will help them as they try to understand some or all of China?
I think this kind of goes to the China is not a monolith point, but the way we talk about it in comparative politics is this concept of what's called fragmented authoritarianism. And that goes back to Kenneth Lieberthal, but the basic idea is that even with all the centralization of power that we see in the Chinese system, especially under Xi Jinping, this is still a very messy place. And a lot of the kind of policy outputs we observe are the product of bargaining and policy entrepreneurship from actors all over the system. So it's not the case that everything that happens in China is personally dictated by Xi Jinping. And sometimes that means that the system, when we see mixed messages or signals coming out of the system that don't quite make sense, it might just be because different parts of the system are speaking. And I think, for example, one area that's relevant right now is I think there's a lot of chatter in China of trying to rebuild people-to-people exchange, right? There's this whole emphasis on getting 50,000 American students back in China. And so you see the Ministry of Foreign Affairs really talking a big game about that and really focusing on almost dampening down tensions in order to facilitate that. But then on the other hand, we do see incidents where foreigners are having some trouble in China. And we've seen people being detained at the airport. We've seen businesses broken into and so forth. And so that's a bit incongruous, right? But it might just be that, okay, the MFA is sort of more pro-exchange, and then we have the MSS and the kind of security apparatus that's putting a little bit of a damper on that. In the same way that in our system, right, there's a difference between different parts of the US government, and while they coordinate, they do operate relatively independently, right? So things that are happening at our Customs and Border Patrol are outside the purview of the State Department, and they might have different vision about how those things should go. So I think it's just important to remember that while Xi Jinping is powerful, he's not all powerful, and understanding a kind of fragmented nature of the system is always, I think, an important thing to think about when you're trying to understand what's happening in China.
For sure, yeah, and appreciate you flagging that. I struggle with this one because it strikes me as both self-evidently true that China's not a monolith, fragmented authoritarianism, at the same time that Xi Jinping has just a disproportionate vote and influence on major policy decisions. So I struggle to sort of figure out, how do you split the difference between Xi Jinping is not all powerful, but he's pretty gosh darn powerful?
Well, and I think part of it is just being comfortable with ignorance, right? Being comfortable with not knowing. And I find in settings where I'm talking to people in government about what do I think about what happened, and often they'll ask me for an answer and I'll say, I don't know. And maybe that's because I'm not a particularly good analyst of Chinese politics, but I think usually we don't know, right? Is it coming from the big guy at the top, or is it just something that happened, some lower level official did, or some even private sector actor did, and now the system is trying to manage it or cover it up or do whatever it does. So we often don't know the locus of action. And I think and that's generally true of Chinese politics, right? We don't know the relationships at the elite level between these guys. We think there's factions. We think these sorts of things matter. But the truth is we know shockingly little about high-level elite politics in China and decision-making. And so I think just being okay with that and being humble about what we do and don't know, that's always another good heuristic, I guess.
I guess it's just different domains of incentives, because policymakers have to make choices and take actions, and so often have to rely on imperfect information and judgment. Like, an academic cannot know the answer, and that's okay.
Oh, and that's almost celebrated, right? So I'm sitting in here.
It's not to say one is better than the other. It's just, if everyone in the US government just kind of did the shoulder shrug emoji of like, we can't really know, then we wouldn't be making choices and decisions. Now, obviously, the United States is pretty good in foreign policy of making bad decisions based on overconfidence. Again, I struggle with this one as well, where I think you're absolutely right from an epistemological perspective. But then it's like, if you're sitting in the National Security Council, or Department of Defense or Commerce, you have to make judgments based on that sort of imperfect information.
Well, and I think another analog would be, when we interact with our Chinese counterparts, one of the things people try to emphasize is that the United States is not a monolith, right? So the actions and rhetoric coming out of Congress does not represent the Biden administration. The Biden administration doesn't have control over whether congressmen choose to visit Taiwan. It can voice an opinion, but it doesn't have control. These are independent, autonomous actors. And I think on the Chinese side, often there's difficulty in understanding that all these different actors do have real autonomy. And so our China policy is not clean. It's this sort of amalgamation of all these different voices. And so we try to train our Chinese counterparts to understand our system that way, yet we often don't really think about their system that way, when I think they're a little bit more similar than we might think.
I appreciate you saying that, because I was just thinking, I've literally never heard anyone in any of these discussions say to me, the US isn't a monolith. But I appreciate you saying
it's not, right? That's obvious.
No, for sure. So we're doing something different with this podcast. And actually, you're the first person I approached about doing this, which is returning to classic journal articles. We're obviously not doing this to boost our listenership, because it's the absolute wrong way to do it. But nonetheless, I just think intellectually going back and looking at previous scholars who have made outsized contributions to the field and making sure that these papers have lives beyond academia. So really appreciate you being the guinea pig for this. And I asked you the paper that you thought was a real classic, or at least had an outsized role on your own thinking. And you immediately answered Timur Kuran's paper, Now Out of Never, The Element of Surprise in the East European Revolution in 1989. So this came out in World Politics, October 1991. Let me just ask you at a high level, an intellectual level, why did you choose this paper?
This is one of those papers that I think everybody reads in political science PhD programs. So it's in the canon. It's on every reading list. And it's also one of those papers that when you read it, sort of things start to connect and lights start to go off and idea bubbles. It's just one of those things that you read it and it does blow your mind. It sounds pretty obvious after you've read it, but it's really just a nice treatment of the topic of revolution and how revolutions emerge. It's one of those pieces that keeps giving. It's useful in understanding contemporary events and social movements, not just revolution, but any type of social movement. It's just a classic piece. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it today. I will try to punch it up. It is a piece with game theory in it. It's not for the faint of heart, but For those listeners who are kind of more academically inclined, I would encourage you to read it. It's really just a rich piece of analysis that we'll get into today.
Yeah, just maybe I'll punch it down a bit just so you haven't just scared people away. I will say it's also just a really beautifully written piece that is, much of it is looking at series of events that occurred in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, starting in 1989, quoting from Václav Havel, Solzhenitsyn, and others. So there's definitely game theory, but I would say it's also just a generally accessible paper relative to almost anything coming out of political science journals now.
That is true. It represents a different era in political science where really the ideas mattered a lot and the prose mattered a lot. So I completely agree with you. You read some of these classic pieces and they're quite legible, whereas the stuff we're producing now is much more obtuse. So yeah, I'm glad you made that interjection.
So let's get into it. Maybe just I can ask to summarize what sort of Kuran is doing in this paper. The subtitle captures really what the puzzle is the element of surprise in East European Revolution of 1989. So can I just ask you to start going through at a high level, what's the jumping off point in this article and what is he trying to do here?
It's important to remember the paper was written in 1991, October of 1991. And so Kuran was very much reacting to the political events that were unfolding in the world, not particularly China, though, of course, I think he had the Tiananmen movement in mind probably when he was writing, although I don't think he talks about China a whole lot in this paper. But in particular, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the general jumping off point is that effectively no one saw it coming, right? So there was this general feeling among experts and even people in those societies that these regimes were stable, they were strong, they weren't going anywhere. But then all of a sudden, things took off and history changed course. And what Kuran is trying to do in this paper is tell us how revolutions emerge. And the core argument, there's a few pieces of it, but the core argument, the quote that people always use is that let me find it here. I shall argue that the East European Revolution was by no means inevitable. What was inevitable is that we'd be astounded when it arrived. So this idea, there's the only thing predictable about revolutions is that they're unpredictable. They catch us off guard. And then he goes into detail about why that happens. And that's where this idea of preference falsification comes in, which we can talk about more.
Let's get into preference falsification, but I'd like to sort of ease our way into it by just maybe posing a question to you, which is, and please here draw on your own research in addition to Kuran's analysis, but just talk about the mechanics of why it is hard in advance to predict the emergence of a political revolution and certainly the emergence of dynamics that could lead to regime collapse. And very much, by the way, I should say the context for this is we're in another moment, and there have been many of these, over the last 4 or 5 decades of feeling that there's rising discontent in China, right? So we have economic growth is slowing down. Just anecdotally, you hear more from what we'll call sort of the elite strata, folks that I engage with who are grumbling about the direction of travel of China. You're starting to see real estate, wouldn't necessarily call it crisis, but certainly high degree of volatility in the real estate market, which is 25% of China's GDP, and where most Chinese citizens have in addition to their savings account, if they have excess wealth, it's there, and that's where they're seeking asset appreciation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's probably the subtext for this discussion today. But just talk about why is it necessarily challenging to connect dots between some of these structural factors, right, which we know exist and we know there's rising grumbling. Why does that not necessarily translate into sort of a mobilized political opposition?
There is a body of work that does try to predict revolution. There are factors that matter, but I think one of the things that hampers that line of inquiry is, first of all, revolutions just aren't that common. They're rare events. And so in a given country, in a given year, the probability of revolution at any given time is pretty much always less than 1%, right? So it's hard to predict things that don't happen very often, just as a statistical matter. That's one part of it. But then the other part of it is, the way I tend to think of it is these structural factors set the preconditions for revolution, right? We can think about, well, what do you need for a revolution, right? You need the population to be upset about something. You need a uniting grievance. Typically, people talk about economic factors like inflation or low economic growth or high unemployment. These sorts of things matter. But that happens in a lot of places a lot of the time where there aren't revolutions. And so that's sort of like the straw. You need the match, right? You need something to light it off. And those events, those are what sometimes people call shifts in the political opportunity structure. This is a fancy way of saying a spark, right? Something that ignites the underlying grievances in the population. Those events are quite random, right? And it could be, in the case of China, right, the death of a former leader. It could be a fire in an apartment building in Xinjiang, right? We don't quite know. And there's a lot of candidates for those sparks, but the ones that actually take off, there is something just inherently random about it and unpredictable, which is, I think, why Kuran wrote this paper and why it's still useful.
Let me back up a step or two before we get to the spark. If we're just thinking about opposition to a regime at any given time, there's sort of publicly expressed, there's also sort of demonstrated, right? Mobilization, joining activities, waving banners, putting signs in window. Then there's the quiet part, right? Which is just preferences that any individual holds at any given time. And private preference might be different from public preference. I'm now basically spelling out the formula of preference falsification. But I wanted to quote something from Kuran's article, which is he sort of talks about there's two, at the time in 1991, there were sort of two ways of thinking about this. There was like the structural school, which is talking about the factors, rising crime, unavailability of bread, geopolitical turmoil. And then there's the rational choice school, which is looking at how an individual actor navigates that. And he's got this quote saying that the crucial insight of the rational choice school is that an individual opposed to the incumbent regime is unlikely to participate in efforts to remove it, since the personal risk of joining a revolutionary movement could outweigh the personal benefit that would accrue were the movement a success. It is generally in a person's self-interest to let others make the sacrifices required to secure the regime's downfall. For a revolution constitutes a collective good, a good he can enjoy whether or not he has contributed to this realization. That seems self-evidently true. Before we started recording, you talked about some other ways of talking about how people want to belong in groups. You want to be socially desirable. There's a whole number of reasons why people don't necessarily act on their privately held thoughts in addition to fear about, potential punishment. Can you talk, before we get to the spark, what has to happen in terms of that sort of private preference, public preference, their interaction, or other features before a spark will actually catch? You have to imagine there are times in which a spark could go off and nothing happens because the requisite, elements haven't sort of conjoined. So what do we know about what needs to happen for a spark to actually make a difference?
Yeah, I think underlying support for the regime is critical, right? And the issue, of course, for all of us is we don't really know how to measure that well, because there is this potential disconnect between how people say they feel in a public setting or even on a survey versus how they feel in their heart of hearts. And so if a bunch of people in their heart of hearts are angry about something, and I think obviously the most recent example in China is zero COVID and the kind of wildfire that unleashed in November of that year, that is what it takes. You need a large underlying grievance. But what's always interesting is there could be large underlying grievances and discontent that we don't quite observe because of this reason you just identified, right? Which is there are costs to sticking your neck out. There are costs to voicing discontent and to engaging in opposition activity. And so someone might be really angry about something, but nevertheless keep their mouth shut. That's the fundamental crux of the whole thing, right? Is we don't actually really know where the discontent is, how pervasive it is, and whether or not, when we observe high levels of support, maybe the population is really happy, or maybe they're just faking it. And that's this idea of preference falsification. And that's a fundamental dilemma for an authoritarian regime, right? In creating a repressive environment to facilitate social control, you also don't really have the ability to fully gauge how your own population feels about you. That's the nature of not having a free environment. And so that's the kind of underlying thing. And Kuran calls this a latent revolutionary bandwagon, right? This is a big jargony concept, but this idea that there might be widespread grievances in the population that could take off that we just don't know about. And all it would take would be that little tipping point, that little spark to set things going.
Related to that, he quotes de Tocqueville from the Ancien Regime, which is French for the old regime, by the way. He quotes de Tocqueville as saying, patiently endured so long as it seemed beyond redress, a grievance comes to appear intolerable once the possibility of removing it crosses men's mind. So, related to that, just the idea that your desire for change and appetite to participate that might not be fixed before, might not be fully formed, or actually might evolve as events occur that indicated the possibility of change, right? So something just may be purely tolerable and just may be pure grumbling, and you're actually not even contemplating a change in the political status quo. But once events, a spark sets off, suddenly you might be willing to join that. You now feel that there's the possibility for change in status quo.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite things about the Quran piece is it allows you to think about different types of people in society. So he has this little parameter in his framework, which is the psychological cost of engaging in preference falsification, right? Which is basically how much does it hurt you to feign support for this government? This is different across different people. And in any given authoritarian society, there are people for which that cost is just too great. Like they can't do it. They can't self-censor. They can't go along with it. They can't fake it. These are the dissident types. I've been privileged to interview many of them and get to know some of them pretty well. And they're, no matter what the regime does, they're not going to go along with it. They're going to agitate for political change and for democracy because that's how they really feel. So these are kind of the first movers in a revolution. They're the kind of true believers, the most hardcore. And that's what's interesting is in any social movement, it's the first people on the ground are usually different, right? They're the kind of the most intense with their preferences. And then revolutions do have a social dynamic. Social movements have a social dynamic, right? Which is once people start seeing people do something, maybe I'm not a dissident type, but maybe I'm pretty angry. And I see the dissidents out there and I'm like, okay, well, all right. Now that they're out there, maybe I can come. And then people who know me say, oh, wow, Rory's out there. He's pretty much a coward. So if he's out there, that means I can go out there, right? So there's this bandwagoning thing where there is a safety in numbers. And the more people that join, the safer it becomes, right? It's hard to repress 1 million people simultaneously. It's easy to repress 5, right? So that's why it does spread like wildfire, right? Because different types of people, more and more normal people start to join these events. But what's interesting is that then it's hard for a revolution, or often they're leaderless or quasi-leaderless, and it's hard for them to build cohesive coalitions, right? Because the people that joined at the beginning typically are a little bit more radical. They want to push things a little bit farther than the people who joined in the middle or the end. And the people at the beginning are kind of the true believers. And there's an inherent tension as a revolution unfolds where they go from being a really kind of hardcore, extreme political cause to sometimes even like a social event, right? So it becomes something that people go to. And even in Tiananmen, right, there's images of people dancing and all that. So it becomes a bit of more of a fanfare at times. And so that's an inherent kind of tension, I think, that the Quran framework helps us think about.
Rory, I want to stick for a minute with just the unpredictability factor. And this maybe gets us right into this concept of preference falsification, which actually, returning to the heuristic conversation earlier, I think is a really great mental tool as as we make judgments about how solid or not any autocratic system is. But Quran writes, neither private preferences nor the corresponding thresholds, by which he means sort of thresholds for these collective action to tip over and become a sort of a movement. Neither private preferences nor the corresponding thresholds are common knowledge. So a society can come to the brink of a revolution without anyone knowing this, not even those with the power to unleash it. And here I think about moments of surprise, certainly for external observers, like you're talking a few minutes ago about the fire out in Xinjiang, which led to several deaths, which in ways I could not have predicted led to, or at least was a catalyst for, the sort of nationwide anti-zero COVID protests, the A4 protests. Can you talk a bit about that? Really gets to the heart of this preference falsification concept, which Quran discusses in the article. What is that?
Well, I think what you're getting at is this idea of pluralistic ignorance, which is in these places, no one really knows how other people feel. You might have a good read about the politics of your close friends and family, so people you feel comfortable having these types of conversations with. But beyond that, and then of course there's social media chatter, things like that. There's other kind of loose indicators of the mood. But beyond that, nobody really knows how other people feel. And, that's true in most social settings, not just authoritarian systems. But in democracies, there's polling, there's kind of more open social media environments. And the bigger issue is that there's a little bit in an authoritarian system, because of the fear of repression, there's always this potential for performative regime affirmation, right? So people might be engaging in regime affirming rituals and studying Xi Jinping thought or doing whatever they're supposed to be doing, but in their heart, not truly buy into the system. And so normal, everyday people don't really have a good read on this. And I think even the regimes themselves struggle to really gauge how things are going. And there's observable markers, right? So there's things like protests or, social media comments, but these are crude ways of thinking about the level of discontent. And so this is something that just governs how these societies feel.
Kuran quotes from, Václav Havel's very famous The Power of the Powerless, and I think many will have heard this section read before, but it gets to the heart of how difficult it is to make these assessments, even internally. He talks about the very famous greengrocer who hangs in his window of his store, "The workers of the world unite." And of course, if you're walking by, you could think grocer Rory is a firm supporter of the communist movement and the regime because he's got this sign there. And then I'm going to just quote from it. Havel says, but this gets to the heart of what Solzhenitsyn calls the lie of participation with the system, or what Solzhenitsyn calls basically the regime holds together with billions of tiny fasteners, several dozen to each man. This neat idea of even if folks don't like the regime, they're both victim and perpetrator in the sense that they are helping to prop it up, but for very individual, very understandable calculations. And Havel says, the overwhelming majority of shopkeepers never think about the slogans they put in their windows, nor do they use them to express their real opinions. Poster was delivered to our greengrocer from the enterprise headquarters, along with the onions and the carrots. He puts them all into the window simply because it has been done that way for years, because everyone does it, and because that is the way it has to be. If he were to refuse, there would be trouble. He could be reproached for not having the proper, quote, decoration in his window. Someone might even accuse him of disloyalty. He does it because things must be done if he is to get along in life. It is one of the thousands of details that guarantee him a relatively tranquil life, quote, in quote, harmony with society, as they say. So it gets to my next question I want to ask you is you're doing a lot of work and there's a body of work of trying to understand public opinion. And I think related to that is degrees of regime support, popular support in China, but this also applies to other authoritarian political systems. How do you navigate that challenge and that tension of having to use tools that try to gauge degree of popularity, support, approval of, using polling or other questionnaires and other methods with this idea of preference falsification? And I realize there's far more sophisticated than the greengrocer, but still wonder if that challenge shows up for you and how you try to work around it.
Yeah, this is like a critical issue for our field because we do want to understand public opinion in China as best we can, but we don't quite know how much we can trust the data because according to the data, the Chinese Communist Party is basically the most beloved government in the world, other than maybe I think Vietnam has higher scores in certain areas. But in terms of confidence in government, satisfaction with the central government, these sorts of measures, they're extremely high. And in fact, they haven't changed since zero COVID. I've collected more recent data and those numbers aren't dipping. What do we make of that? And I think one knee-jerk reaction is to say, oh, this is all BS, right? We shouldn't be using this data at all. We can't glean anything from it. And I tend to kind of think, well, we just need to be more creative. And so I don't want to get too into the weeds, but there's a lot of tools in psychology and political science where people have tried to develop question techniques that basically protect the respondent more, where they're measuring their preferences using things like reaction time to a sorting task. Like they're just doing it in such convoluted ways that the person doing it can't fake it. They're not in any real danger, right? There's no risk to them. And so I think my general feeling at this point is the Chinese Communist Party the most beloved government in the world? Probably not. But it's also, I think, the support is still probably quite high. So maybe it's not 95% of the population supports the government. Maybe it's more like 20 to 30% lower. We don't really know. But I think even using these kind of more sophisticated tests, you still do tend to see reasonably the majority of the population affirming the government, even with these kinds of sensitive measures. There's still some limitations there for sure.
Reading the paper now, 15 years after grad school, anything that stuck out to you that you didn't appreciate the first time, and especially now that you've been doing work, that is directly related to this idea of preference falsification for a long time now?
The way I'm kind of thinking about Kuran is this is a paper that really features this idea of faking it, right? Or getting by what you referenced, the greengrocer, living within the lie. There's just different ways of saying this, but this idea that people in these societies probably don't really like the government that much, but they do what they need to do to get by. And that's just kind of how they cope. And that's the sort of central idea of a lot of the dissident literature and certainly of the Kuran piece. One thing I'm working on right now, and I'm getting deeper into research in psychology, and I think one thing to note is that preference falsification is painful for people. And we've all done it. Like, this is not something that's unique to authoritarian societies or citizens. Like, if you sit in a faculty meeting and a question comes up, you're like, am I really going to fight on this one, or am I just going to go along to get by? Like, we all do this in professional settings and social settings. We kind of say what we need to say and maybe bury how we feel sometimes. That's just part of being a professional person and any person. But it doesn't feel great. And I think one thing that I think I've come to disagree with Kuran is this idea that the people in these societies are just, that's how they cope. They just sort of, they live within the lies, so to speak, and they're existing in this kind of state of cognitive pain. Because I think the other way to think about it is you can either live within the lie or you can rationalize what's going on around you. And there's a whole body of work in psychology, it's called system justification theory, which is that it's much easier cognitively to affirm and support a system. And what the literature shows is that even people who are being actively oppressed by a system or a political environment, they often affirm it and support it because it's cognitively easier that way. So it's easier to say, oh, we're the good guys, China is good, the CCP is good. It's easier to think in those terms than to say, oh gosh, look at my lot, I'm stuck, I'm being oppressed, there's nothing I can do about it. And so the reason I bring this up is because I think my one qualm with the preference falsification Kuran type idea is I think it can lead us to misread some of these societies, right? So we might be sitting here in DC or wherever we are thinking, oh, wow, the Chinese people are on the brink of revolution at any given moment. And they secretly want what we have. They secretly want democracy. And if only we can get them VPNs and then the Communist Party will be gone. Like, I think that's fantastical thinking. And I think the reality is most people in these societies aren't just coping. I think they come to buy into the system. They accept it because that's easier on them cognitively. And that might not be what we want to hear. And that's not to belittle them or disparage them in any way. I try to always internalize what Kaiser Kuo has always said about cognitive empathy. We need to empathize with people in these other systems. That's my read 15 years later. Is I think Kuran has a lot to say, but I also think we can't take that as truth for how people are thinking in these places because I think it can lead us to miscalculate.
Great final comment to end this with. The idea behind the discussion on this paper was this is just one of those moments where I think we need big eyes and big ears as we try to make sense of China. It's becoming more challenging to have widespread, deep engagements across the political system. It used to be relatively easier. We're in a moment of great flux in China's own domestic trajectory, international politics. Taking a step back and trying to be, as you say, a little bit humble about what we know. What are the questions we don't know? Where are the gaps? And so really appreciate the willingness to have this discussion today. Really appreciate you flagging Kuran's paper, which is just a great way to sit down and meditate on these issues, and look forward to having you back on the podcast at some point.
All right. Thank you so much, Jude.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog